Hello and welcome to The Understudy, the channel that teaches you everything about musical theater. My name is Philippa, and today I will read from Broadway Musicals, the 101 Greatest Shows of All Time by Ken Bloom and Frank Blasnick. To get the full version of the book, I recommend getting the physical copy, as images and certain inserts from the book won't be displayed here. I do not own this material, I'm just reading from a place of entertainment and education, and I will not edit these audio recordings as I go, so you will get the unabridged version. Today I will go through section S, starting with Sally. Opened December 21st, 1920 at the New Amsterdam Theatre with 561 performances. Music by Jerome Kern and Victor Herbert. Book by Guy Bolton. Lyrics by Clifford Gray. Butterfly Ballet. Music by Victor Herbert. Orchestra under the direction of Gus Saucer. Produced by Florence Ziegfeld Jr., staged by Edward Royce, settings designed by Joseph Urban, costumes designed by Alice O'Neill. Synopsis. Poor orphan Allie Rhinelander is brought by the rich society lady Mrs. Ten Broek to the Alley Inn, a theatrical boarding house, to work as a dishwasher. Sally's dream, however, is to be a dancer in the Ziegfeld Follies, and she is encouraged in her fantasies by the often drunk waiter Connie. Blair Farquhar, son of one of the richest men on Long Island, bumps into Sally, who immediately falls in love with a handsome man. Connie is invited to a ball of the Farquhar estate and meets theatrical agent Otis Hooper, who is looking for a Russian ballerina to entertain at the ball. Sally pretends to be Russian, but when her real identity is revealed, she is banished to the kitchen. Hooper, still believing in the girl, casts her in the Follies, and like all Follies girls, Sally weds a millionaire, Blair. Cast: Pops, Alfred P. James, Rosalind Rafferty, Mary Hay, Otis Hooper, Walter Catley, Mrs. Ten Broek, Dolores, Sally of the Alley, Marilyn Miller, Blair Farquhar, Irving Fisher, Jimmy Spelvin, Stanley Ridges, Connie, Leon Errol. Star power can be an engine to propel a musical into the stratosphere. A star can make an otherwise lackluster show into a hit. Lauren Bacall in Applause and Hugh Jackman in The Boy from Oz are good examples. Sometimes, as in Funny Girl, The King and I, or The Music Man, a star is so identified with a role that all subsequent productions pale in comparison. In the case of Hello Dolly or Fiddler on the Roof, a show can open with a big star who defines a role, but other performances are capable of keeping the show running. Sometimes, as in The Producers, when the star or stars leave, the box office plummets. Sometimes stars turn out to be actors who aren't billed as stars, as is the case of Gwen Verdon, who became an overnight sensation in Can-Can, but much to the chagrin of Lilo, the show's nominal star. And Jude Carne was the billed star of the revival of The Boyfriend, but it was a featured Sandy Duncan who got all the reviews. What is it about stars that make them so special? Talent alone isn't enough. In fact, many of Broadway's biggest stars weren't the best singers, dancers, or actors, but they all shared with a wonderful rapport with the audience and an indefinable quality that projected their personality up to the highest balcony. We don't mean to disregard talent, of course. A great performer has to work on owning his or her natural gifts. Marilyn Miller, whose biggest success was Sally, knew that when she hadn't built upon the talent she was born with. And she had the good sense to realize that unless she improved, her career and fame could not blossom. Once she was hired by Florence Ziegfeld for Sally, Miller got serious about her craft, spending up to 18 hours a day on singing, acting, and dancing lessons, and exercise classes. And her singing and acting markedly improved, and the critics said as much in reviewing the show. Since the show featured a score by the team of P.G. Wodehouse, Guy Bolton, and Jerome Kern, and additional lyrics by Clifford Gray, Miller had to rise to meet her material, and excellent material it was, too. The two biggest hits of the score, Whip Poor Will and Look for the Silver Lining, came from the Kern and Bee Gees De Silva show Zip Goes a Million, which closed out of town. Another hit song, Wild Rose, perfectly showcased Miller's delightful charm. All her hard work had paid off, and Miller became a bigger star than ever. At one performance, the applause became so deafening, Miller ran out of the 40 seconds out to 42nd Street with members of the audience following her, bringing her back to the theater for an encore. She became the toast of Broadway, and thanks to the generosity of Ziegfeld, she was the first female musical star to receive a percentage of the box office gross. In order to ensure that she didn't decamp to Hollywood, which in fact she had no intention of doing, Ziegfeld gave Miller a chauffeur-driven limousine, jewels, and furs. Marilyn Miller's success resulted in a long run on Broadway, an extensive national tour, and most important to us, a film version of the show with Miller providing today's audiences with a brief taste of the lighter-than-air persona of the radiant Marilyn Miller, a star it turns out for all ages. Marilyn Miller, the personification of the term charm star, achieved an unparalleled popularity during her brief reign in the late 1920s. After appearing in vaudeville, she became a sensation dancing on point and adding her teeny-tiny singing voice and delicate beauty to editions of the Passing Shows and the Ziegfeld Follies, catapulted to superstardom in the title role in Sally, 1920. Her follow-up vehicles were all in similar vein, primarily variations on the scrappy rags-to-riches heroine. In Sunny, Rosalie, and Smiles, she introduced the standards Look for the Silver Lining and Who, among others. In her final Broadway show, the revusical As Thousands Cheer, Miller revealed an untapped flair for sophisticated comedy, playing Barbara Hutton and Joan Crawford in sketches with the sommelier Clifton Webb. Leading a much more complicated life than her ever-optimistic characters, she was married 4 times, had a long-running affair with Ziegfeld, and had a reputation for being impossible to work with. Miller died at the age of 37 from health issues magnified by alcoholism. 1776, opened March 16, 1969 at the 46th Street Theatre with 1,217 performances. Produced by Stuart Ostrow. Book by Peter Stone, music and lyrics by Sherman Edwards, musical director Peter Howard, music orchestrated by Eddie Sauter, dance arrangements by Peter Howard, vocal arrangements by Elise Breton, directed by Peter Hunt, musical staging by Anna White, scenic design by Joe Meisner, lighting design by Joe Meisner, and costume design by Patricia Sipfort. Synopsis. John Adams is frustrated that the Continental Congress refuses to recognize the importance of the colony's independence from Great Britain. A thoroughly abrasive personality, Adams teams up with Benjamin Franklin, a more level-headed statesman, to convince the members to break from the mother country. Richard Henry Lee, a delegate from Virginia, convinces his fellow Southerners to entertain the idea. It's finally decided that a Declaration of Independence is in order, and Thomas Jefferson is elected to draft the paper. Arguments to its contents ensue. The Northerners want slavery abolished. The Southerners call the Brethren hypocrites. Jefferson's writing progresses slowly until Adam Franklin arranged for Martha Jefferson to pay her husband a conjugal visit and restore his concentration. Finally, the Declaration of Independence is ratified, just in time for the 4th of July holiday. Cast: John Adams, William Daniels, Stephen Hopkins, Roy Poole, Benjamin Franklin, Howard De Silva, John Dickinson, Paul Recht, Richard Henry Lee, Ronald Holgate, Thomas Jefferson, Ken Howard, Edward Rutledge, Clifford David, Abigail Adams, Virginia Westhoff, Martha Jefferson, Betty Buckley. The musical 1776 belongs to the rare breed of shows in which the libretto is stronger than the score. This isn't to say that 1776 has a bad score, but the libretto could convincingly stand alone, without Sherman Edwards' contributions. There are a few other shows, very few, in which the libretto stands out as the premier element. City of Angels comes to mind, though we like the score too, as does the more recent Sweet Smell of Success. And today's Wicked and the producers have receivable scores married to excellent books. Serviceable scores married to excellent books. Peter Stone, a librettist with a track record unequal to his reputation, certainly struck dramatic gold with his libretto for 1776. The libretto does follow actual historical events, and it's a remarkable story in its own right. But Stone accomplished a miracle. Although the audience certainly knows the outcome of the story, unless they slept through 7th grade civic classes, Stone instills a real sense of suspense. There's an actual moment of doubt as to whether the damn declaration will be signed or not. In his second historic libretto for Titanic, the first letterbox musical, Stone had much more difficulty grasping onto a narrative line. The action bounces around the decks, zeroing in on one or another passenger or crew member, connecting emotionally with the only few dancers who had clear-cut motivations: the stoker, the telegraph operator, and a second-class woman desperate to mingle with society. With the story fully equal to the signing of the Declaration of Independence in dramatic impact, Stone was reduced to pointing up the ironies of history in his libretto, assigning many of the characters banalities about the frigid weather and lack of lifeboat drills. But in 1996, Stone gave the many characters distinct personalities, using historical data to develop the characters. He had the added foresight, after cutting an unnecessary scene at the tavern, to set the play almost entirely within the confines of what should become the Independence Hall. Sherman Edwards, who had written a few minor teenage-oriented pop songs, surprised everyone with the quality of his score, his first and only for the Broadway stage. Like Meredith Willson of Music Man fame, he seemed to have only one really good show in him. But as fine as Edwards' score is, and a lot of the praise has to go to orchestrator Eddie Saunter and the cast, Peter Stone's book is a revelation. He created a realistic Malo and three-dimensional characters, and imbued the proceedings, somewhat stolid and archaic political discussions, with a real sense of urgency and drama. Peter Stone. Book writer Peter Stone began his career with two shows that didn't quite set the word ablaze: Keen, starring Alfred Drake, and Skyscraper, Julie Harris's only foray into musicals. Undeterred, Stone finally achieved success in 1969 with his greatest work, the highly literate book for 1776, really a play with songs, as one 35-minute stretch is completely without music. After that, the 1970s found Stone scripting the unhappy Danny Kaye vehicle 2x2 and adapting the screenplay for Some Like It Hot, musicalized as Sugar. Stone racked up two hits in 1980's Woman of the Year and My One and Only, salvaged during a particular hellish Boston tryout. My One and Only's director, Tommy Tune, called upon Stone to write another historical piece, the vaudeville biomusical The Will Rogers Follies. Tune then hooked Stone up with another frequent collaborator, the composer Maury Yeston, and together they wrote the Tony-winning Titanic. His last work is most unnecessary. In order to make the 1999 Bernadette Peters revival of Annie Get Your Gun palatable for modern audiences, the book was rewritten in the name of every untutored producer's catchphrase, political correctness. Unfortunately, in Stone's revisal, instead of an increased relevancy, the book somehow became much more inane and creaky than Herbert and Dorothy Field's excellent original. His last show in the posthumously produced musical Curtains, 2007, with score by Kander and Ebb and book and lyric revisions by Rupert Holmes. Howard Da Silva. Howard Da Silva, a brilliant character actor whose presence in a few landmarks shows made him an important figure. First sang in the historic The Cradle Will Rock in 1938. Never had a natural musicals. His singing voice could be best described as highly audible. His excellent acting made him the choice of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein to create the role of Judd Fry in the original production of Oklahoma. After being blacklisted for refusing to testify before HUAC during the 1950s communist witch hunt, Da Silva maintained a low profile until he was cast as Ben Marino in Fiorello, stopping the show with his two numbers, Little Tin Box and Politics and Poker. After writing the book to his undeniably strange The Zulu and the Seda in 1965, he next appeared as Benjamin Franklin in 1776. And even with the tour de force scene cut from the show out of town, Da Silva was a resounding success, repeating his performance in the film version. Health problems forced him to leave the 1776 cast immediately after the opening, so he was replaced on the cast album by Rex Everhart. His stage appearances in the 1970s and 80s were limited, but Da Silva continued to work as producer and director. She Loves Me opened April 23rd, 1963 at the Eugene O'Neill Theatre with 302 performances. Produced by Harold Prince, music by Jerry Bach, lyrics by Sheldon Harnick, book by Joe Masteroff, based on a play by Miklos Laszlo, musical director Harold Hastings, music orchestrated by Don Walker, incidental music arranged by Jack Elliott, directed by Harold Prince, musical staging by Carol Haney, scenic and lighting design by William and Jane Eckert, costume design by Patricia Sibrot. Synopsis. George Novak, a salesman at the Marazek Perfumier, is carrying a romantic pen pal relationship with dear friend, a woman he believes he has never met. In fact, the woman in question is Amalia Balash, who works alongside George. In real life, they hate each other. What will happen when they discover it's a thin line between love and hate? Cast: Amalia Balash, Barbara Cook; George Novak, Daniel Massey; Ilona Ritter, Barbara Baxley; Stephen Codley, Jack Cassidy; Mr. Marazek, Ludwig Donath; Ladislav Sipos, Nathaniel Frey; Arpad Laszlo, Ralph Williams; head waiter, Wood Romoff; violinist, Gino Conforti; busboy, Aldasio. Fear of intimacy is a common problem among humans, and so it is with musicals. Many wonderful intimate shows have been injected, stretched, inflated, embellished, and enlarged beyond its tender means. The process ruined the otherwise wonderful Dear World. It overwhelmed the tender memory musical The Happy Time. It kitsched up the simplicity of Here's Love, and it buried the soft gentility of Sugar Babies. All right, maybe not Sugar Babies. Okay, definitely not Sugar Babies. Some shows just scream to be big. Showboat, 42nd Street, Phantom of the Opera, Jumbo, well, the name says it. But others would benefit from the adage, less is more. Director-producer Harold Prince had the wisdom to keep She Loves Me small. The trials and tribulations of the employees of the perfume shop don't demand big production numbers, dazzling settings, or a huge, blasting orchestrations. Barbara Cook, who could raise the roof as she amply exhibited in Candide, pulled back and drew the audiences into her character, allowing her acting to come to the forefront. This is only fair since he was paired with Daniel Massey, who was a marvelous actor but only a middling singer. Though it's been called a jewel box of a musical, and candy box, and a bonbon, She Loves Me isn't quite as small and intimate as it seems. It did, after all, fill the stage of the Eugene O'Neill Theatre, but the orchestrations, reliance on a stage movement rather than choreography, restrained use of the chorus, and general lightness of touch made it an intimate romantic musical of the first rank. Not surprisingly, it's especially difficult to revive successfully. The urge is always there to expand the moments, enlarge the performances, and insert a few side gags. That was one of the problems in the 1993 Roundabout Theatre revival. If you are going to present a cream puff, don't give the audience a 10-tiered wedding cake with rose columns and too much schlag. Barbara Cook, an exceptional singing actress and the owner of the most distinctive and ageless soprano voices ever, has had a varied career in the musical theater as is possible. Playing every imaginable female type, she has traveled from the entire range of musical theater territory as ingenue, Flahuli, soubrette, plain and fancy, comic ingenue, Candide, leading lady, the Music Man, above the title star, The Gay Life, diva, She Loves Me, and bikini-clad temptress, Something More. After The Grass Harp, another flop with another treasurable magic moment, The Thrilling Chain of Love, she entered the concert world with Carnegie Hall Evening and finally became a full-fledged legend. Since 1985, apart from the Follies concert at the Lincoln Center, the closest Cook has come to starring in a book musical on Broadway was in the pre-Broadway Stratford production of the legendary misfire Carrie, when she nearly decapitated one evening by an errant piece of scenery. She wisely took it as an omen and bailed out. Today she is regarded as our greatest interpreter of the American popular song. Jack Cassidy. Jack Cassidy, the epitome of the debonair matinee idol with a deeply veined streak, started his career with almost 10 years in the chorus. He first garnered attention as a young leading man in the shows Wish You Were Here and Shangri-La, hitting his stride in the 1960s in She Loves Me, Fade Out, Fade In, and It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's Superman. His tour de force turns in these three shows, titled respectively Grand Knowing You, My Fortune is My Face, and The Woman for the Man, helped him create his own type, cornering the market of the slightly smarmy, self-possessed lady killer. After an out-of-town closing, replacing Alfred Marks in the Frank Loesser's last musical Pleasures and Palaces, and the disappointing Maggie Flynn opposite wife Shirley Jones, he fought the changing tide of Broadway and personal demons while touring nightclubs and working in television. His death in 1976 fire robbed us of the third act of Cassidy's Broadway musical career. Backstage. The basis of the story for She Loves Me has inspired movies for over 60 years, from Ernst Bean Lupstick's The Shop Around the Corner through the MGM musical Into the Good Old Summertime to the Tom Hanks Meg Ryan vehicle You Got Mail. At the opening night party for the New Haven tryout of She Loves Me, director Harold Prince surprised the company by playing singer Lena Horne's soon-to-be-released pop recording of the show's title song. When a star Daniel Massey, the son of actor Raymond Massey, best known for his playing Abraham Lincoln in the films, commented on how nice it was that Lena Horne wanted to sing his big number. Jack Cassidy, without missing a beat, replied, "Why wouldn't she? After all, your father freed her people." Showboat opened December 27th in 1927 at the Ziegfeld Theater with 572 performances. Produced by Florence Ziegfeld, music by Jerome Kern, lyrics and book by Oscar Hammerstein II, based on Showboat by Edna Ferber, music orchestrated by Robert Russell Bennett, musical director Victor Baravel, choral director William Vaudrey, directed by C. Colvin and Oscar Hammerstein II, choreographed by Sammy Lee, settings by Joseph Urban, costumes by John Harkrider. Synopsis. Cap and Andy and Parthy Hawks run a showboat on the Mississippi River. When their daughter, Magnolia, sees the riverboat gambler Gaylord Ravenel, it's love at first sight for both of them. Also on the boat is the sultry singer-actress Julie, who takes Magnolia under her wing. Julie is exposed as partially black and is forced to leave the showboat, and Gaylord and Magnolia marry and have a daughter, Kim. Although they are still in love, Gaylord's gambling destroys the marriage and Magnolia is forced to seek work in nightclubs. Cap and Andy catches up with Magnolia at the Chicago World Fair and convinces her to come back to the showboat. She returns with Kim, and many years later, Gaylord returns to complete the family. Cast: Queenie, Auntie Jemima Tuscardella; Parthy Ann Hawks, Edna May Oliver; Cap and Andy, Charles Winnegar; Ellie, Eva Puck; Frank, Sammy White; Julie, Ellen Morgan; Gaylord Ravenel, Howard Marsh; Magnolia, Norma Terrace; Joe, Jules Bledsoe. What Gone with the Wind is to movies, Showboat is to musical theater. The staggering achievement of its epic musical play is all the more remarkable given its place in musical theater history. For when Showboat opened in 1927, the art form was still in its adolescence. Operettas were the rage, as were the light musical comedies with an emphasis on their burlesque and vaudeville roots. Social commentary of any kind was unheard of, and there were three-dimensional characterizations. In addition, musicals of its era shied away from tragic elements, and white audiences, the vast majority of Broadway theater goers, were quite unused to seeing blacks portrayed on stage in anything but the most stereotypical ways. Going against the grain in every way, Showboat had a unique setting, not the cut-out cardboard mountains of Rockies or cabarets of Paris, but the environs of the mighty Mississippi River. Only the scenes set at the Chicago World's Fair can be construed as typical operetta locale. While the show had its root in operetta, the plot was something totally new, uncompromising in its seriousness. Few of the characters in Showboat are without flaws, and although most are sympathetic, happy endings aren't in the cards for many of them. The struggles of the all-too-human Ravenel, Magnolia, and Julie for better, happier futures give the show its drive. Showboat is also unique in that there were no villains. The ensemble, comprised of 36 white chorus girls, 16 white chorus girls, 16 white chorus boys, 16 black male singers, and 16 black female singers, and 12 black female dancers, was used in a new way. As World's Fair, rather as characters on the Mississippi, audiences on the Showboat, and visitors on the World's Fair, rather than the prancing pony chorus lines previously used to pump up production volume. Showboat was also different in a way that was noted by Florence Ziegfeld in a historic letter to Jerome Kern. After marriage, remember your love interest is eliminated. The show's epic qualities give it its weight and importance, and the mature and serious nature of its sympathetic characters make it a classic. The score by Kern and Hammerstein was, of course, a huge part of the show's success, in addition to the important leap forward in the integration of song and story that had been long pursued by Kern, Hammerstein, and a few of their contemporaries. The scope of the composition is frankly stunning. Reflecting the epic nature of the story with its showy breadth, with its own breadth, it offers soaring ballads, spirituals, cakewalks, jazz, and torch songs. Hammerstein's use of the vernacular and poetic language in both the lyrics and dialogue was unlike that of any other musical. In the songs, especially, Hammerstein expressed his compassion with the characters. Where the story might lead them to heartache and strife, the music bared their souls. The score to Showboat spawned no fewer than 6 standards, a record for the musical theater. Producer Florence Ziegfeld doesn't seem the obvious choice for a producer of a seriously artistic and uncompromising musical, but perhaps he didn't realize how groundbreaking it would be. Kern and Hammerstein, however, believed in the possibilities of the musical theater and was determined to treat Edna Ferber's sprawling novel with the respect it deserved. Ziegfeld built his new theater on 6th Avenue expressly for Showboat, but the time needed to write such taunting work caused the show to be postponed, and Ziegfeld had to open his new house with a good but typical operetta, Rio Rita. Its success meant that Showboat's opening would have to wait till Rio Rita closed. Although Ziegfeld had major doubts about the commercial viability of Showboat, he was keenly aware of the reputation of never ever scrimping on a show's physical production. So despite his misgivings, he spent money lavishly, ensuring that its opulent look equaled the excellence of the writing. When it finally opened after sellout engagements in Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Philadelphia, Showboat proved to be the biggest success yet in American theater and an influential show for decades to come. It played for almost 2 years in New York to sold-out houses, grossing nearly $50,000 a week. It had been revived many times on Broadways and throughout the world, and it has been filmed 3 times. Helen Morgan. With an early career in Chicago saloons and honky-tonks, Ellen Morgan, the most famous torch singer of all time, made her theatrical debut in a touring company of Sally. Hitting New York, she became a sensation in the speakeasies of the Prohibition era, singing her My Man Done Me Wrong songs sitting atop an upright piano so as to be seen above the crowd at the underground clubs. Perfectly suited to the musical revue format of Broadway in the 1920s, she attracted notice from a more legitimate audience in George White's Scandal of 1925 and Americana 1926. Before producer Florence Ziegfeld, composer Jerome Kern, and lyricist Oscar Hammerstein II cast Morgan as the tragic octoroon Julie Laverne in Showboat in 1927. She gave a performance that is still considered legendary more than 75 years later, full of helpless joy as she stopped the show with Can't Help Lovin' That Man, later dissolving the Ziegfeld Theatre to tears with her forlorn, fragile rendition of Bill, perked atop her trademark piano. Morgan starred in Sweet Adeline 2 years later, once again with a score by Kern and Hammerstein, introducing the weepy standards Why Was I Born and Don't Ever Leave Me. She made a few film appearances, but she was beginning to lose her long battle with alcohol. With a personal life as tragic as many of her songs, Morgan retired due to poor health and years of drinking, soon after filming the magnificent 1936 movie version of Showboat. At the age of 41, she succumbed to cirrhosis of the liver in 1941. Jerome Kern. Jerome Kern, one of the greatest composers of the early days of the musical theater, became a success when his lovely song They Didn't Believe Me was interpolated into The Girl from Utah in 1914. Teaming with Guy Bolton and P.G. Wodehouse to write a series of musicals for Broadway's Intimate Princess Theater, their hits Very Good Eddie, 1915, Oh Boy, 1917, and Leave It to Jane, 1917, made strides toward the integration of plot and songs, and with their accessible settings and regular Joe characters, were a refreshing change from the exotic, foreign locales of the operetta. He continued with hit after hit, including the Marilyn Miller vehicles Sally, 1920, with its standard Looking for the Silver Lining, and Sunny, 1925. With lyricist librettist Oscar Hammerstein II, he changed the course of musical theater history with his versatile, sophisticated, and deeply felt score for Showboat, which includes such classic songs as Make Believe, You Are Love, Old Man River, and Can't Help Lovin' That Man. Kern also teamed with Hammerstein on Sweet Adeline 1929 and Music is in the Air 1932, and worked with Otto Harbach on The Cat in the Fiddle 1931 and Roberta 1933. After a sojourn in Hollywood, he and Hammerstein wrote their most beautiful and admired song, All the Things You Are, from the 1939 Very Warm for May. After more movie musicals, he returned to New York to begin work composing Annie Get Your Gun with lyricist Dory Fields, but he suffered a stroke while walking the streets of Manhattan, dying at the age of 60. Shuffle Along opened May 23, 1921 at the 63rd Street Music Hall with 504 performances. Produced by Nico Producing Company, music by U.B. Blake, lyrics by Noble Sissel, book by Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles, directed by Walter Brooks, dances arranged by Charles Davis and Lawrence Dees, orchestra under the direction of U.B. Blake, musical arrangements by Will Watery. Synopsis. Jimtown is holding an election and there are 3 candidates, Steve Jenkins, Sam Peck, and Harry Walton. Peck and Jenkins, co-owners of the grocery, promising that whoever is elected, they will name the other chief of police. Of course, neither can be trusted, for both are skimming money from the store's till to finance their campaigns. Unbeknownst to each other, they hire the same private eye to spy on their partner. Jenkins wins the election and promptly gets into a fight with his chief of police, but by the curtain's fall, Harry Walton, the guy everyone's wild about, leads a reform movement and unseats the crooks. Cast: Piano, U.B. Blake; Jesse Williams, Lottie G; Ruth Little, Gertrude Saunders; Harry Walton, Rogers Matthews; Tom Sharper, Noble Sissel; Steve Jenkins, Flournoy E. Miller; Sam Peck, Aubrey Lyles. The problems facing blacks on Broadway in so many ways mirrors societal issues. The minstrel shows that lead up to the emergence of musical comedy employed white performers in blackface, indulging in the most outrageous stereotypes. Black minstrel companies began to tour the country, further cementing the stereotypes of the white shows, with black performers themselves forced to don blackface. Soon after the end of Civil War, a new middle class emerged in the black population and began to strive for equality, both in society and in the theater. Many of these blacks were educated in the new African American universities, and those with music majors yearned for equality both socially and professionally. Legendary black performer Bert Williams and George Walker starred in The Goldbug, 1896, at the Casino Theater. But the first all-black Broadway musical, written by and starring African Americans, was A Trip to Coontown, in 1898, with songs by Bob Cole. Cole wanted to emulate traditional white musical theater. The second black show on Broadway was Clorinda, also in 1898, with music by Will Marison Cook and starring Ernest Hogan. When it arrived, Cook explained, "Negroes are at last on Broadway and here to stay." Cook believed that the African American should make his own style of theater and not emulate what the white artist could always do as well, generally better. Cook also wrote the first black musical to play on London's West End, In Dahomey, 1903, and the first interracial musical to play Broadway, The Southerners, 1904. Black Broadway shows continue to emerge sporadically, including Mr. Load of Coal and The Red Moon, both produced in 1909. The last all-black Broadway show of this period was 1911's Honor the Barber, with music by J.T. Brim. By 1909, the number of black shows has diminished due to the deaths of Ernest Hogan, Bob Cole, and George Walker. For in addition to their skills as performers or songwriters, these men also managed their companies that were constantly on shaky financial ground. Still, companies like William and Walker's, without Walker, the Black Paddy Troubadours, the Smart Set, and Negro Players all produced shows throughout the United States until the 1920s. Following the limited integrations of World War I and newfound interest by society folk in black artists, the time was ripe for a new generation of black songwriters to try their hand on Broadway. Whereas their black predecessors leaned toward operetta forms for their musical, Noble Sissle and U.B. Black straddled the line between ragtime and Tin Pan Alley. Performers and producers Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles, along with Sissle and Blake, chose Miller and Lyles' popular vaudeville sketch, The Mayor of Dixie, as their basis for conquering the Great White Way. To get there, they realized they needed the help of a white producer. So Al Miller, the white booker for the Keith Circuit and friend of Miller and Lyles, took his friend Harry Court to lunch. Harry, the son of theater owner and producer John Court, after whom the Court Theater is named, liked the idea and an audition was set up with his father. The audition went well, and John Court agreed to give the company a lecture hall a half-mile from the northernmost point of Times Square, the 63rd Street Music Hall. Al Mayer became the show's manager. Opening night, audiences were enthusiastic, but reviewers from the major papers were slow in attending. When they finally appeared, the reviews were mostly excellent, and business started picking up. The company added a Wednesday midnight performance, which was heavily attended by the theatrical folk. Shuffle Along soon grew into the most successful show on Broadway. Adding to the fame of the show was the popularity of the song I Just Wild About Harry, which earned as many as 10 encores a show from singer Lottie G and dancer Bob Lee and was recorded hundreds of times, eventually serving as Harry Truman's campaign song. Another song from the show, the beautiful ballad Love Will Find a Way, also became a hit, despite trepidation that white audiences would not accept blacks singing a romantic love song. Among the famous performers who got their start in various companies of Shuffle Along were Paul Robeson, Josephine Baker, and the legendary Florence Mills. William Grant Still, the famed classical composer, and Hal Johnson, founder of the Hal Johnson Choir, played its original pit orchestra. Still, the most important legacy of Shuffle Along is not its excellent score or its star-studded alumni. It brought a new respect and regard for black performers. opening the door for shows like Lou Leslie's Blackbird series and Porgy and Bess, among many others. Noble Cecil and Eubie Blake. The team of Noble Cecil and Eubie Blake met on May 15, 1915, in Baltimore, Maryland, at a rehearsal for Joe Porter's Serenaders. They teamed up the same day and began a lifelong friendship and collaboration. Cecil was an accomplished vocalist, and Blake was one of the finest ragtime players and composers. After their theatrical debuts with Shuffle Along, Cecil and Blake contributed to a number of Broadway shows, the last being Shuffle Along of 1952. Among their songs were such standards as I'm Just Wild About Harry, You Were Meant for Me, and Andre Charlotte's Review of 1924, and the Blake Andy Ray Staff standard Memories of You from Blackbirds. That men of their talents, also including Raffair and sometimes partner Thomas Fats Waller, never achieved more fame on Broadway or were summoned to Hollywood was simply due to racism. Both Cecil and Blake achieved a new appreciation and renaissance with publication in 1972 of Robert Kimball and William Balcom's Reminiscing with Cecil and Blake. Star Turns, Part 3. George Balanchine. Choreographic genius George Balanchine brought a new, higher level of dance artistry to the musical theater. His Princess Zibonia and Slaughter on 10th Avenue ballets for On Your Toes raised the bar of dance on Broadway from the usual kick line of chorus girls, paving the way for subsequent legends Jerome Robbins and Agnes DeMille. His brilliant work graced such productions as Babes in Arms, I Married an Angel, The Boys from Syracuse, Song of Norway, and Where's Charlie? After the flop Courting Time in 1951 and being replaced by Herbert Ross on House of Flowers, 1954, he left the Broadway scene to focus solely on ballet. He built the New York City Ballet into the world-class company it remains today, returning only to oversee the recreation of his ballets for the two Broadway revivals of On Your Toes. Dolores Gray. Dolores Gray, thrilling singer and actress who had a belt as solid as Gibraltar, more curves than the Indianapolis Raceway, and features that were strangely ugly and beautiful all at once, made her debut wearing little more than a smile in the review Seven Lively Arts. After a triumph in London starring the British company of Annie Get Your Gun, she returned to the States to co-star Bert Lahr in the review Two on the Aisle. Never one to shy away from an offstage battle, her vituperative feud with top banana Bert Lahr made all the papers. Next, opposite John Waite in Carnival in Flanders, she set a still-standing record for the shortest run ever to garner a Tony Award for one of its performers, 6 performances. Gray went to Hollywood, lending her intimate style, perfect for the excess of the Technicolor musical, to such MGM films as Kismet and It's Always Fair Weather, where her production number, Thanks a Lot But No Thanks, has entered the pantheon of Camp Heaven. Another famous feud, this time with Michael Kidd, once Fair Weather co-star, now director-choreographer of Destiny Rides Again, went as far as fisticuffs. Her last original role in a musical was the short-lived Sherry, in which she considerably brightened the proceedings with her trademark verve. After a run in 42nd Street, she scored one final musical triumph in England, socking out a clear, strong I'm Still Here in the London revisal of Follies. Lou Fields. Lou Fields, half of the team of Weber and Fields, and patriarch of the Fields theatrical family, formed the act with fellow Lower East Side resident Joseph Weber. They became a huge hit in the theater as the German-accented characters Mike and Mayer. Specializing in perfectly choreographed gymnastic slapstick routines, Weber and Fields incorporated burlesque of contemporary shows and politics, becoming masters of topical humor. The titles of some of their shows indicate their light-hearted tenor: Whoop-de-doo, Fiddly-dee-dee, 30 Whirly, and Whirligig. Weber and Fields were so successful they soon opened and operated a theater. After dissolving his partnership with Weber, Fields had his own theater, approximately named Lou M. Fields Theater, and branched out into producing more refined musical comedies and operettas. He produced several shows by composer Victor Herbert, including Old Butch, in which Helen Hayes made her Broadway debut at the age of 9. Lou Fields was responsible for producing the first works by the then young team of Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart, many of them written in collaboration with his son, librist Herbert. Fields was also the father of the brilliant lyricist Dorothy Fields, whose first book musical, Hello Daddy, he produced. Fields' third play was playwright Joseph Fields. Fields' third child was playwright Joseph Fields, best remembered for teaming with Jerome Chodorov on a series of plays and librettos to Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Wonderful Town, and Flower Drum Song. Weber and Fields reunited after a 30-year hiatus to open Radio City Music Hall in 1932. David Merrick, perhaps the most famous, or infamous, Broadway producer, was known for his cutthroat business tactics, his surly demeanor, and sometimes outrageous publicity stunts. He scored an incredibly impressive number of hits in the 1950s and 60s. Fanny, for which he had a statue of belly dancer erected in Central Park, Jamaica, Desiree Rides Again, Gypsy, Take Me Along, feuding with star Jackie Gleason, Irma La Douce, Do Re Mi, Carnival, feuding with star Anna Maria Albergetti, I Can Get It For You Wholesale, Oliver, 110 in the Shade, Hello Dolly, feuding with just about everyone from Gower Champion to the lead usher, I Do, and Promises, Promises. So particular and predictable were his tastes that advertising agencies referred to a certain color used over and over again on his posters, as David Merrick Red. His most notorious publicity stunt was for the 1961 flop Subways Are For Sleeping. He found 7 New Yorkers with identical names of the major critics and printed their reviews of the shows, instead of the poor reviews it actually had received. Additionally, he caused furor when he closed the foundering breakfast at Tiffany's in previews, telling the press that he was sparing the public an incredibly dull evening in the theater. He was debilitated by a series of strokes in the 1980s, so other than a few last gaps in the 1990s State Fair, Merrick's real swan song was 42nd Street, where, true to fashion, he topped himself once again when he announced the death of director Gower Champion to a stunned theater at the opening night curtain call. Audra McDonald, one of the most respected and honored singer-actresses of the last decade, Audra McDonald attended the Juilliard School of Music. After a brief appearance as replacement in The Secret Garden, McDonald, then billed as Audra Ann McDonald, was catapulted to prominence when she was cast as Carrie Pipperidge in director Nicholas Hytner's brilliant retelling of Carousel, produced at New York's Lincoln Center. Winning a well-deserved Tony Award for the role, she became such sought after as both a dramatic and musical actress. Her varied roles have included Sharon, the opera student in Terence McNally's Master Class, and doomed Sarah in the epic musical Ragtime, each netting her another Tony. MacDonald has thrived on the concert scene as well, singing with orchestras around the world and recording numerous CDs celebrating both classic and contemporary musical theater. Winning a 4th Tony for his subtle, touching performance in the 2004 revival of A Raisin in the Sun, MacDonald most recently graced the Broadway stage with a stunning turn as Lizzie in the revival of 110 in the Shade. Venturing onto the small screen, MacDonald is now in the cast of Grey's Anatomy spin-off Private Practice. Here's hoping that her budding television career doesn't keep her away too long from the theater that very much needs her. The Sound of Music. Opened November 16, 1959 at the Lundfontein Theatre with 1,443 performances. Produced by Leland Hayward, Richard Halliday, Richard Rogers, and Oscar Hammerstein II. Music by Richard Rogers and lyrics by Oscar Hammerstein. Book by Howard Lindsay and Russell Krauss, based on the Trapp Family Singers by Maria Augusta Trapp. Musical director Frederick Vonsch. Music orchestrated by Robert Russell Bennett. Co-arrangements by Trude Whitman. Directed by Vincent J. Donahue. Musical staging by Joe Layton. Scenic design by Oliver Smith. Costume design by Lucinda Ballard. Lighting design by Jean Rosenthal. Mary Martin's clothes by Mayne Botcher. Synopsis. A postulant at Nonnberg Abbey in Austria isn't quite suited for the nunnery. Instead, Maria is encouraged by her mother superior to take a job as governess of the 7 unruly children in the widowed Captain von Trapp. Maria's freewheeling ways rub the captain the wrong way, but while he is away on business, she teaches the children to express their emotions through song. The captain returns with his fiancée, but is gradually won over by the innocent charms of Maria. With the rise of the Third Reich, the family escapes across the Alps, filled with the sound of music. Cast: Maria Rayner, Mary Martin; the mother abbess, Patricia Newey; Captain George von Trapp, Theodore Bickel; Liesel, Laurie Peters; Rolf Gruber, Brian Davies; Elsa Schrader, Marion Marlowe; Max Detweiler, Kurt Kasnar. Postulant: Bessie Maysu Ella Yeager. Truly, The Sound of Music was a show better suited to the movies than the stage. As the curtain rose in the stage version, Maria was seen in a tree with the backdrop of the Alps behind her. No matter what they did to make it look real, it was still a chicken wire and papier-mâché tree in the Lundfontein Theatre. In the movie's version, Julie Andrews twirled in a meadow amid the real Alps, as captured by a magnificent helicopter shot. A song like Do Re Mi that came across as slightly inspiring on stage became a rooster on the screen. What with the quick cutting of travelogue shots of Salzburg. The final chase and escape of the mountains was more vivid in the film, and The Sound of Music, a show that on Broadway was a hit, took a mammoth proportions after the film version was embraced by the public. Of course, had the show been written a century earlier, it would have been gladly accepted by local gentry. For most operettas took place in the faraway kingdoms, usually Austria or some other Eastern European setting. Fake drops and less than accurate accents didn't matter, since the most theatergoers had only seen black and white pictures of foreign lands and probably had never met an actual person from Eastern Europe, unless of course they had mistakenly ventured into the poorer sections of Manhattan. Not all locales and genres are suited to the stage. That's one reason Westerns have never enjoyed so much cachet as a musical form. How do you get all those horses on stage, and where would you ride them? Destry writes again solved the problem by taking place mainly in a saloon. Baseball musicals were always considered impossible to stage until Damn Yankees came along, but it proved an exception to the rule. While Sweeney Todd is an exception to the generally held belief that horror themes aren't suitable for musicalization. In truth, there's probably no subject that can't be made into a successful musical in the right approach, if the right approach can be found. Everyone thought that Shaw's Pygmalion was impossible to transform as a song and dance show, no less than the Rogers and Hammerstein took a crack at it, and Lerner and Lowe's first attempt evoked nothing but despair. And if anyone had told you that a musical would be made from a group of T.S. Eliot poems about cats, or the signing of Declaration of Independence, or the opening of trade feudal Japan, or, well, the list goes on and on. The Sound of Music begins as a sweet, some say saccharine, story of a governess winning over a bunch of recalcitrant children and their straight-laced father. When all of a sudden the Nazis enter the picture and the show transforms into The Great Escape. That the two halves peacefully coexist is thanks to the skills of Rodgers, Hammerstein, Lindsay, and Krauss. In its best moments, The Sound of Music is a superbly well-constructed audience pleaser in the best tradition of the old-fashioned book musical. Lucinda Ballard. Costume designer Lucinda Ballard had a great career on Broadway dating back to 1938. Her greatest work was the stunningly opulent costumes for the Viennese-flavored The Gay Life, written by her husband Howard Dietz. She created the clothes for many plays, including the original A Streetcar Named Desire, that historic t-shirt, and such musicals as Annie Get Your Gun, Street Scene, The Fascinating Experiment of Allegro and Love Life, Silk Stocking, and the stylish Lederhausen and Wimples of The Sound of Music. Ballard retired after The Gay Life, although she received many offers to take care of Dietz, who suffered from Parkinson's disease. Until the 1970s, Ballard has received more Tony Awards than anyone else. Joe Layton. Joe Layton, as director and choreographer, had never had a career wildly varied in quality, but with every smash hit he's tailed by at least two dismal failures. After two successes, Once Upon a Mattress and The Sound of Music, he had a flop in Tenderloin. After his stylish, groundbreaking work on No Strings, he directed the misguided The Girl Who Came to Supper and Sherry. And his sharp, non-stopping staging of George M. was followed by the relative tedium of Dear World and 2x2. A failure truly undeserving of its fate was Drat the Cat, which, like Love Life, Anyone Can Whistle, and a handful of other shows, was too special, too quirky to ever succeed in a commercial environment. Starring Elliot Gould and the delightful Leslie Ann Warren, Drat the Cat featured stunning latent set pieces, including a kabuki burlesque and a choreographed overture showing a jewel thief on a spree that are still talked about today. Spending much of the 1970s directing concerts and nightclub acts, including Bette Midler's Clams on the Half Shell and Evening with Diana Ross, Layton returned to a vehicle for newly crowned Broadway star Alexis Smith. Rebounding from that show, the flop Platinum, he surprised everyone with his wonderful, confident direction of the circus concept of Barnum. Thereafter, it was all downhill for Layton, with the quick failure of Bring Back Birdie, a show that seemed like a mistake to everyone in New York, save the producers, Rock and Roll, The First 5,000 Years, a show ahead of its time, The Three Musketeers, and Harrigan and Hart. Backstage, Howard Lindsay and Russell Crowe referred to the operatic ladies who portrayed the nuns as the Bull Nuns. Mary Martin commemorated a childhood friend, Bessie May Sue Ella Yeager, by putting her name in each of her movies as Martin's character name or other character. It soon became a good luck charm, and Martin began putting the name into her shows. It didn't work for One Touch of Venus or Lute Songs, but in South Pacific, Martin introduced the girl doing barrel rolls in the CB's show as Bessie May. Oscar Hammerstein caught on to the superstition and vowed to find a place for Bessie May's name. It wasn't exactly an Austrian name, but Martin's understudy, Renee Gurin, also played a postulant in a crossover. So it was decided to bill her in the credits as postulant, Bessie May Sue Ella Yeager. 2 years later, the government sued the real Bessie May for not declaring her income from the appearance in The Sound of Music. South Pacific opened April 7, 1949 at the Majestic Theater with 1,925 performances. Produced by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II. Produced in association with Leland Hayward and Joshua Logan. Music by Richard Rodgers. Lyrics by Oscar Hammerstein II. Book by Oscar Hammerstein and Joshua Logan. Based on Tales of the South Pacific by James A. Michener. Musical director Salvatore de la Sola. Music orchestrated by Robert Russell Bennett. Directed by Joshua Logan. Musical staging by Joshua Logan. Scenic and lighting design by Joe Meisner. Costume design by Motley. Synopsis. Emile Debec, a middle-aged French planter, falls in love with the nurse and seeing Nellie Forbush. One of the islanders, the crafty Bloody Mary, has her eye on the handsome Lieutenant Cable for her beautiful daughter,
Lyot. They fall in love, but Cable finds it difficult to reconcile the differences of their races. Nellie, meanwhile, meets the Beckett children and is shocked that they are of a mixed race descent. Depeck and Cable are recruited to spy on Japanese troop movements in a very dangerous mission. While they are away, Nellie bonds with the children and grows to love them. Cable and Depeck's mission is successful, but Cable is killed by the Japanese. Depeck returns home to find Nellie and his children waiting with open arms. Cast: Nellie Forbush, Mary Martin; Emily Depeck, Ezenio Pinza; Lieutenant Joe Cable, William Tappert; Bloody Mary, Juanita Hall; Lyot, Betta St. John; Luther Billis, Myron McCormick. Just purchasing the right to a novel or film can play with the idea of musicalizing said property is not enough to ensure that the resulting show is a hit, nor is the fame or excellence of the source an indication of how well the adaptation would run. In fact, there's a theory that moderately successful source makes for the best musical, since there's more room for expansion and tinkering. When choosing a property to adapt, Rodgers and Hammerstein never went after the A-list commodities. Green Grow the Lilacs, the basis of Oklahoma, was a failure on Broadway and generally unknown to the general public. The reminiscences of Anna Leonowens were the only known because of the film Anna and the King. Cannery Row wasn't Anna and the King. Cannery Row wasn't one of Steinbeck's best-selling novels, nor was C.Y. Lee novel Flower Drum Song well known. So it was too with The Stories That Compromise, Tales of the South Pacific by James Michener, though the collection did win the Pulitzer Prize. Josh Logan was the first to read the story Fodola and grew so excited he immediately called producer Leland Hayward the idea of Rodgers and Hammerstein musicalizing the tale. Richard Rodgers, flat on his back due to recurring back pains, had nothing much better to do than read the story. He loved it and recommended it to Oscar Hammerstein II. Rodgers had the foresight to suggest that he and his partner buy the rights to the entire book, not just the one story, cutting out Josh Logan in the bargain. They did so and sourced the book for a second story to merge with the first, finding it in Our Heroine, the story of Emile Depeck and Nellie Forbush. With two plots intertwined, breaking their own rule for one serious plot and one secondary comic one, they looked for a third story to leaven the seriousness of the first two. To help the team, Michener penned a third story especially for them, creating the character of Luther Billis. Once they had the basic characters in place and a plot to link them, they received a lucky phone call from Edwin Lester, the producer of the Los Angeles Civic Light Opera. Lester had signed Ezio Pinza for a musical to be decided upon later, but couldn't find an appropriate property and was about to lose the great singer. With Pinza signed, the rest of the package fell quickly into place. Mary Martin was playing Annie Oakley in the Rodgers and Hammerstein-produced Annie Get Your Gun on the West Coast. She agreed to play the part, provided that she not have a duet with Pinza, fearing that the great singer would blow her off the stage. Rodgers and Hammerstein brilliantly solved the problem by writing the twin soliloquies. Though South Pacific has its lighter moments, at heart it is a serious piece with the theme of racial prejudice running through the two main plots. Everyone is familiar with Cable's song You've Got to Be Carefully Taught, which he sings when confronting his own difficulties in an imagining marriage to a Polynesian girl, Lyot. Nellie also confronts her insensitives when, ready to marry Emile Depeck, has second thoughts on meeting his children of mixed ancestry. Nellie overcomes her prejudice, but Cable is killed before he can completely come to terms with what he knows is wrong. The writing came extremely slowly to Hammerstein, and Logan was called to the librettist's farm in Pennsylvania for a few days of consultation. Logan was such a help that he stayed until the script was essentially complete, collaborating on every aspect with Hammerstein. A few weeks later, Logan, spurred by his wife, Neda Harrigan, confronted Hammerstein with the request that they share credit. Hammerstein immediately agreed, later refusing to share royalties with Logan. After all, Rodgers and Hammerstein had the right to the underlying material, even if it was at the behest of Logan. Because he had worked so hard on the project and deeply believed in it, Logan agreed, but it caused a rift between him and his former friends. Some people have observed that Rodgers was the tough businessman and Hammerstein had the heart. While Rodgers was indeed intractable and impossible, he cheated the Hart family out of royalties after Lawrence Hart died. Hammerstein went along with all of Rodgers' wishes and never stood up to his partner. Now, when Rodgers' personality has been permanently scarred by recent comments of his friends and family, Hammerstein is still portrayed as the great humanitarian. No matter what the failings of each of these giants, their works live on, thrilling audiences of every generation with their sense of humor, wisdom, and drama. Juanita Hall. African-American singer, actress Juanita Hall, who made a career out of crossing racial boundaries, made her musical debut in the ensembles of Sing Out Sweetland in 1944 and the 1946 revival of Showboat. After supporting roles in St. Louis Women and Street Scene, she broke through the unflaggingly businesslike Bloody Mary in South Pacific, winning a Tony Award and becoming a star introducing the songs Bali High and Happy Talk. She played the wise yet unflaggingly businesslike Madame Tango in House of Flowers before she recreated her role of Bloody Mary in the movie version of South Pacific, where, inexplicably, she was dubbed. After another switch of races as the thorough sensible Chinese woman Madame Liang in Flower Drum Song, which she also portrayed in the film, this time singing for herself, she retired due to health problems, having created 3 major Broadway roles in 10 years. Joshua Logan. As writer-director, Joshua Logan was a major force in the Broadway theater for over 30 years, beginning his musical career directing the hits Knickerbocker Holiday, By Jupiter, and This Is the Army. Logan became the hot commodity when he directed the wonderful Annie Get Your Gun in 1946. With another smash in South Pacific, which he co-authored, he turned around the problematic Wish You Were Here in 1952, finding another long-running hit in Fanny 2 years later. All of his efforts displayed an inordinate amount of male pursuit, an apparent obsession that raised many an eyebrow along the Great White Way. After Fanny, such a straight drama hits as Mr. Roberts, Logan's golden touch seemed to disappear, and he turned out flop after flop, including All-American, where his staging of the physical fitness number seemed graciously fleshy even for him, Mr. President, Hot September, a musicalization of play Picnic, which he also directed, Look to the Lilies, and the out-of-town disaster Miss Moffat. Also a film director, his version of South Pacific, Camelot, and Paint Your Wagon are among the most disappointing of all Broadway musical transfers. When he died at the age of 79, he was working on the musical version of Huckleberry Finn, even though the musical Big River had opened and won the Tony Award. The Student Prince in Heidelberg. Opened December 2nd, 1924, at the Jolson's 59th Street Theatre with 608 performances. Produced by Messrs. Schubert, book and ensemble staged by J.C. Huffman, dances by Max Scheck, music by Sigmund Romberg, lyrics and libretto by Dorothy Donnelly, based on the play Old Heidelberg by Rudolf Bleichmann, adapted from Old Heidelberg by Wilhelm May Forster, yes. Orchestra under the direction of Oscar Bradley, orchestrations by Emil Gerstenberg, settings by Watson Barat, costumes by Weldy of Paris and Vanity Fair Costumes Company. Synopsis. Prince Karl Franz of Karlsburg and his tutor, Dr. Engel, arrive in Heidelberg incognito. Karl Franz enrolls in the university and soon falls in love with a local waitress, Kathy. Suddenly, the king, Karl's father, dies, and Karl must come home to assume the throne. Sorry, typo. He must leave Kathy, a commoner, and assume his royal duties. But he cannot stop thinking about her. He returns to Heidelberg in Kathy's arm. While they are still in love, the reality of their situation overwhelmed their ability to remain together, and Karl Franz leaves forever. Prime Minister von Mark, Fuller Mellish. Dr. Engel, Greek Evans. Prince Karl Franz, Howard Marsh. Gretchen, Violet Carson. Detlef, Raymond Marlowe. Kathy, Elsa Marvenga. Lutz, George Hassel. Grand Duchess Anastasia, Florence Morrison. Princess Margaret, Robert Abate. Captain Tarnitz, John Coast. Countess Leyden, Dagmar Oakland. A most unusual, or some might say VW, show, The Student Prince is a rarity particularly for its time. A musical with an unhappy ending. Boy gets girl, boy loses girl, and that's it. Still, audiences were entranced by the lush romantic melodies of Sigmund Romberg's and the bravura lyrics of Dorothy Donnelly, one of the musical theater's unsung heroines. The Student Prince didn't contain any of the usual operetta shenanigans, comic relief turns by low clowns and secondary romantic couples. The emphasis was squarely on Prince Karl and Kathy and their doomed love, and to make up for the lack of comedy and lightness, Donnelly and Romberg substituted rousing student songs to enliven the proceedings and give the show depth. Set at Heidelberg University, there was ample time to spend in the beer halls where Kathy worked as a waitress. Ironically, the score is surprisingly muscular and virile, given the rather feminine subject. It was startling to all involved, including its producers. The Schubert brothers expected the usual lackluster Romberg operetta. Jake Schubert, who oversaw the musical, was astonished by the lack of a female chorus and the unusual ending, and, despairing of what he thought was a sure failure, began tinkering with the show. Romberg, a salaried employee after all, objected strongly, and Jake took Romberg's name off the billing. Romberg sued, and just to the prior opening, received his due. The show, to Jake's surprise and grudging pleasure, was a smash hit, making millions for the Schuberts in successive engagements off Broadway and around the country. One of the most widely performed musicals throughout the world, The Student Prince, had succeeded beyond expectations due to its uncompromising but wholly entertainment libretto and the magnificent score by Romberg and Donnelly. Backstage, author W. Thames Music Library, the music publisher of The Student Prince in Heidelberg, was on the brink of bankruptcy when sales of the operetta's sheet music saved the day. The underlying play, the 1901 Alt Heidelberg, had been adapted into two straight plays in New York, Old Heidelberg 1902 and Prince Karl 1904, an Austrian sequel operetta, Young Heidelberg, also in 1904, a Romanian operetta, later in 1904, an Italian operetta, 1908, and a D.W. Griffith silent film in 1915. Two film versions of the Romberg operetta were made, one in 1927, directed by Ernst Lubitsch, and one of the last silent classics, and another in 1954. Sigmund Romberg. Sigmund Romberg composed more than 60 musicals in his 40-year career, making him the most prolific of all Broadway composers. Although Romberg was proficient in most musical theater styles, he achieved lasting fame as a composer of operettas. His most enduring shows are still performed, with Blossom Time, The New Moon, The Desert Song, and The Student Prince, with still favorites, the light opera companies, and summer theaters. Romberg's most famous songs are still sung today, including Deep in My Heart, Lover Come Back, Stout-Hearted Men, The Desert Song, Close as Pages in a Book, Softly as in Morning Sunrise, Serenade, and Will You Remember? Robert came to the United States from Vienna in 1909, almost immediately finding work with the Schubert brothers. Desperate for shows to film their theaters, especially the Winter Garden, home of the revues called the Passing Shows, when Romberg became a Schubert employee, his job was to write numbers that allowed the showgirls to show off their assets in rhythm. He briefly left the Schubert fold in 1919, but after 3 flops, Romberg returned to the safety of a regular paycheck to compose a remarkable series of successful operettas. The New Moon, produced in 1928, was Romberg's last successful operetta, for musical tastes were changing, and Romberg's lush romantic style fell out of vogue. More shows in Hollywood followed, with little acclaim, however. In 1945, Romberg returned with a vengeance with the smash hit, Up in the Central Park, written in collaboration with Dorothy Fields. His last show, The Pink and Girl Tights, was completed in 1954, more than 2 years after his death. Sunday in the Park with George opened May 2nd, 1984 at the Booth Theatre with 602 performances. Sunday in the Park with George, produced by the Schubert Organization and Emanuel Assenberg by arrangement with Playwright Horizon. Music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, book by James Lapine, suggested by the painting A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte and the Life of George Seurat. Musical director Paul Gemignani. Musical orchestrated by Michael Starobin. Directed by James Lapine. Movement directed by Randolyn Sin. Scenic design by Tony Straigs. Costume design by Patricia Sibrat and Anne Hould Ward. Lighting design by Richard Nelson. Synopsis. As George Seurat completes his pointillist masterpiece, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, the relationship between the obsessed painter and his illiterate mistress model Dot collapses under the strain. Flash forward 100 years. The great-grandson of Seurat, a tortured artist in his own right, returns to the scene of the painting to seek inspiration. Visited by the ghosts of Dot, the artist discovers the possibilities of a blank canvas. Cast: George, Mandy Patkin. Dot and Marie, Bernadette Peters. Old Lady and Blair Daniels, Barbara Bryan. Jules and Bob Greenberg, Charles Kimbrough. Yvonne and Naomi Eisen, Dana Ives. Soldier and Alex, Robert Westenberg. Louise, Danielle Ferland. Louise and Billy Webster, Chris Groenedal. Celeste number 2 and Elaine, Mary Darcy. Celeste 1 and waitress, Melanie Vagon. Freda and Betty, Nancy Opel. France and Dennis, Brent Spinner. Nurse and Harriet Pauling, Judith Moore. Boatman and Charles Bredmond, William Perry. No other musical's omissions from the first edition of this book prompted a more passionate outcry from its fans than did Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine's Sunday in the Park with George. Coming only 4 years after the fantastic success of Peter Shaffer's Amadeus, another examination of the demons of a creative genius, Sunday in the Park with George was clearly an intensely personal exploration of the blood, sweat, and tears shed by Stephen Sondheim himself. He had just come off Merrily We Roll Along, the biggest critical and commercial failure of his career. Anyone Can Whistle had an even shorter run, but the expectations for Whistle, only his second produced show as a composer and lyricist, were not as high as they were for his sixth collaboration of the groundbreaking team of Sondheim and Hal Prince. After swearing he was giving up the theater to write mystery novels, Sondheim decided to move on from his 15-year collaboration with Prince and team up with the young playwright James Lapine, who had never worked in a musical theater. Sunday in the Park with George began its life at a 3-week workshop at the Off-Broadway Theater, Playwright Horizons, in July 1983, where its creators hoped to develop the show under the radar of the media. But the participation of its co-star, the wonderful Bernadette Peters, returning to the musical theater after the disappointment of Mac and Mabel and nearly 9 years spent in California, and the rising star Mandy Patinkin, whose Broadway musical career had taken off like a shot after his electrifying turn as Che Guevara in Evita, turned this still unfinished show into the hottest ticket in town. Though the workshop version only had a semblance of a second act at only 3 of its 25 performances, the show was scrutinized and publicized as if it were a full-blown production. When it moved to Broadway, it received mixed reviews, but was championed by fans, particularly at the New York Times, which ran so many pieces about the show that the Sour Grapes Rialto Wags dubbed it Sunday in the Times with George. It received a Pulitzer Prize. The first act of Sunday in the Park is one of the cleverest ever, applying the typical brilliant music and lyric of Sondheim to the fascinating concept of an audience being swept inside one of the most recognizable paintings of its era. With a staccato accompaniment that echoes the technique of pointillism itself, the song, Finishing the Hat, beautifully examines the struggles of George, torn between his responsibility of his true love, art, and his muse and lover, Dot. The finale of the first act, in which George creates order out of chaos, finally freezing the characters into his mind into a tableau vivant of Sirot's paintings, is one of the most emotional moments in Sondheim's canon. The second act featured wonderful songs, including the witty It's Hot Up Here, the dynamic Putting It Together, reminiscent in feel to the metallic urban sound of Company, the simple yet deeply felt Children and Art, and the soaring melody of Move On. Yet in its original Broadway production, the second half of Sunday in the Park with George, as its title is abbreviated by fans who SITPWG, as its title is abbreviated by fans who like to refer to other long title shows as HTSIBWRT and AFTHOTWTTF, was perceived to be the weaker one, heavily handed in its resolution. This shortcoming was certainly magnified by the performance of Mandy Patinkin, whose mannerisms are decidedly acquired taste. Even though he is deniably talented, too many people have told Patinkin over the years that he is the modern-day Al Johnson. It was the remaining of the show's second act for its 2005 production at London Minor Chocolate Factory, brilliantly directed by Sam Buntrock and starring the amazing Daniel Evans, who will reprise the role for the 2008 Broadway revival, where many of our misgivings about the show's second act evaporated. We stand humbly corrected. Bernadette Peters. Bernadette Peters, an ageless adorable whose sex appeal believes her versatility as an actress, made her debut at the age of 13 in a tour of Gypsies starring Mary McCarthy. She made her Broadway musical debut in the bio musical George M., starring Joel Grey, and after co-starring in the mega flop La Strada and On the Town revival, she portrayed a tragic silent screen star Mabel Normand opposite the wonderful Robert Preston in Mac and Mabel. After the show's lamentable failure, she spent next 9 years working in television, film, and nightclubs. When she resurfaced to theatergoers in 1983's Sondheim Sunday in the Park with George, Broadway welcomed her with open arms, and she became the most beloved musical star of a generation. A performance in Song and Dance winning her a well-deserved Tony Award. A rare misstep was co-starring with Martin Short in 1994's The Goodbye Girl, which proved just how elusive the magic of on-stage chemistry can be. She won a second Tony Award for the revival of Annie Gittergun, reasserting her popularity by drawing huge audiences to a less-than-inspired production. Her career came full circle in 2003 as she returned to Gypsy 42 years later, this time playing Rose. Her commitment to excellence in the theater was no more clearly exemplified than when in 1987, as Broadway's reigning queen, she accepted a supporting lead in Into the Woods, unwilling to pass up an opportunity to create another role in a Sondheim show. Long may she reign. Sweeney Todd. Sweeney Todd opened on March 1st, 1989 at the Uris Theatre with 557 performances. Produced by Richard Barr, Charles Woodward, Robert Fryan, Mary Lee Johnson, and Martin Richards. Music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim. Booked by Hugh Wheeler. Based on a version of Sweeney Todd by Christopher Bond. Music orchestrated by Jonathan Tunick. Musical director Paul Gemignani. Directed by Harold Prince. Dance and movement by Larry Fuller. Production design by Eugene Lee. Costume design by Fran Lee. And lighting design by Ken Billington. Synopsis. Benjamin Barker, a barber, arrives in London consumed by the Industrial Revolution and its myriad of vices, having escaped from an unjust imprisonment. He returns to Fleet Street, unrecognizable and having assumed the name Sweeney Todd, to once again take up his craft. John finds a room above the pie shop of Mrs. Lovett, a woman of questionable sanitary values. Todd sets up shop and waits for his chance to give the venal Judge Turpin a very, very close shave, for it was Turpin who commanded Todd to jail, ravish his wife, and is now on the verge of doing the same to his ward, Todd's daughter, Joanna. While waiting for his intended victim, Todd practices on the throats of his customers, sending their bodies into the ovens of Mrs. Lovett to be used in her meat pies, and just in time as the local cat population has mysteriously dwindled. Achieving vengeance, Todd, along with Mrs. Lovett, tragically learns what the judge has learned, that one must accept the consequences of his actions. Cast: Anthony Hope, Victor Garber, Sweeney Todd, Len Cariou, Beggar Woman, Merle Louise, Mrs. Lovett, Angela Lansbury, Trudge Turpin, Edwin Lindeck, The Beadle, Jack Eric Williams, Joanna, Sarah Rice, Tobias Ragg, Ken Jennings, Pirelli, Joaquin Romaguera. Sweeney Todd is a unique, almost unclassifiable musical. We can all agree that it isn't a musical comedy, though it has its moments as hilarious as any in musical comedy. It isn't really an opera, although it doesn't have much dialogue and is performed by opera companies around the world. The best way to describe it might be as a grand guignol musical. The most amazing thing about Sweeney Todd is that it makes audiences sympathetic to a mass murderer and a woman who cooks people into meat pies. What saves Sweeney Todd from being a musicalized horror movie is the intelligence and integrity of the writing by Stephen Sondheim and Hugh Wheeler, and production by a top-of-his-game Hal Prince. Nevertheless, its horror aspect at its core has made the story a perennial. Playwright George Dibdin Pitt's Place, A String of Pearls, or The Fiend of Fleet Street, was first presented in London in 1847, and the story of the demon barber of Fleet Street has continued to entertain audiences for a century and a half on stage, in film and in print. The self-proclaimed arbiters of modern morality might look at the history of this show and realize that audiences have always been interested in the grisly and gruesome. Sex and sexuality are the backdrop to most stories, and escapism and fantasy are an undeniably necessary part of human psychology. Sweeney Todd has it all: violence, sex, deviance, romance, suspense, and humor. Given the richness and theatricality of the material, it's surprising that Hollywood, or better yet, England, hasn't been seen fit to film the musical Sweeney Todd. Since the majority of the action in the original staging took place on a small raised platform containing Mrs. Lovett's pie shop, Sweeney Todd took room upstairs. And the beloved ground kitchen, the only drawback below-ground kitchen. The only drawback was its huge set, a recreation of an iron foundry. Although technically impressive, it distracted many from concentrating on the brilliance of the score and the book. Of course, the barn-like size of the Euros Theatre, now the Gershwin, didn't help matters, for here was a show that was meant to be seen up close. After all, when one sees a horror movie in the cinema, the murders are usually committed to a Technicolor close-up. Then again, the distance from the stage might have worked in Sweeney Todd's favor. After all, reality, particularly a violent one, is certainly heightened when the action is taking place by real people right before your eyes. Sweeney Todd is a musical that can be enjoyed by audiences equally. It is entirely accessible to both intellectuals and the masses, who are equally startled by flashes of steel and the spurting of blood. It accomplishes what best drama strives for, bringing audiences together in a common experience. Hundreds of viewers share laughs, thrills, and in the case of Sweeney Todd, chills at the same time. It's the most important reason to go to the theater. Len Cariou. The very fine actor-singer Len Cariou had been employed for years as a Shakespearean stage actor in his native Canada. Supporting Lauren Bacall in Applause, his solid baritone and masculine presence made him a sought-after leading man. In his next musical, as the frustrated lawyer Frederick Egerman in A Little Night Music, Cariou became a first-ranked star on Broadway, and his scenes with Glynis Johns were funny, bittersweet, and deeply touching, flying in the face of those who accused Sondheim's collaboration with Hal Prince of being
too cerebral and emotionally distancing. Carriot's greatest role was as the vengeful barber Benjamin Barker, now in reinvented and hellbound on revenge as Sweeney Todd. Perhaps that show's near-operatic score was too demeaning for singers without vocal cords of steel, for although the role has never been as chillingly acted, Carriot's singing voice never sounded quite the same after Sweeney, and indeed, his next show, the flop Dance a Little Closer, he seemed to have lost it entirely. In better voice, in 1987's Teddy and Alice, Carriot gave a thoroughly committed performance in a show not worthy of its talent. Although also successful in film, The Four Seasons, and straight plays, The Dinner Party, Carriot is still a frequent face on the New York stage, waiting for another musical on a level with his early triumphs. Jonathan Tunick. Jonathan Tunick, successor to Robert Russell Bennett as the premier orchestrator of his time, began by revolutionizing the Broadway sound with the pit voices and synthesizer Latin charts for Promises, Promises, and orchestrating the 6 Sondheim Prince collaborations of the early 70s and 80s. He showed a versatility and complexity that perfectly complemented Sondheim's. In the metallic urban sounds of Company and pastiches of Follies, the lush, string-heavy A Little Night Music, the Japanese influences of Pacific Overtures, and the operatic score of Sweeney Todd, and at his most brassy and Broadway for merrily along, he helped create the sound of the most important works of the last 40 years. One of the many orchestrators credited on a chorus line, Tunick is so gifted that he has the ability to make a good score sound great. A Good Time Charlie, Nine, Nick and Nora, Titanic. To truly understand his genius, go to your CD player and listen to the various layers and counter melodies of Another 100 People from Company, perhaps the greatest orchestration ever written. Sweet Charity opened January 29, 1966 at the Palace Theatre with 608 performances. Produced by Friar Cart and Harris Inc., music by Cy Coleman, lyrics by Dorothy Fields, book by Neil Simon, based on the screenplay Nights of Caribbean by Federico Fellini, musical director Fred Werner, dance arrangements by Fred Werner, music orchestrated by Ralph Burns, conceived, directed, and choreographed by Bob Fosse, scenic design and lighting design by Robert Randolph, costume design by Irene Sharaff. Synopsis. Charity Hope Valentine is a dance hall hostess, the 1960s version of Ruth Etting's character in Simple Simon, who sang 10 cents a dance. Charity does indeed have a heart of gold and is determined to break out the Fandango ballroom. She accidentally finds herself in the bedroom of Italian film star Vittorio Vidal and dating the neurotic, shy, somewhat nerdy Oscar. When the straight-laced and high-strung Oscar proposes, he insists that he doesn't care about Charity's profession, but in the end, he cares very much, and Charity is soon back to having her toes and heart stepped on. Cast: Charity, Gwen Verdon; Helene, Thelma Oliver; Nikki, Helen Gallagher; Victoria Vidal, James Luisi; Oscar, John McMartin; Good Fairy, Ruth Buzzy; Herman, John Wheeler; Ursula, Sharon Ritchie; Rosie, Barbara Sharma. Based on the Italian film Nights of Caribbean, Sweet Charity was a perfect property for the married team of the musical comedy legend Gwen Verdon, the closest thing to a singing, dancing Guillermo Messina, and the genius director-choreographer Bob Fosse. An auteur much like Federico Fellini, with boundless imagination and an instantly recognizable style. Even though it sported a truly funny book by Neil Simon, undisputed champ of modern-day New York comedy, and fresh pop-influenced score by Cy Coleman and legendary lyricist Dorothy Fields, Sweet Charity was undoubtedly Fosse's triumph. The show was all about dance, from Verdon's solo dance to Charity's theme, as the curtain rose to I'm a Brass Band, the joyful strut for Charity and a battalion of stick-toting drum majors. Between those was the star turn for Verdon. If my friends could see me now, where all Fosse needed was a top hat, a cane, and Verdon's incandescent charm to wrap the entire Palace Theater around her crooked, choreographed little finger. There's gotta be something better than this. A foot-stamping flamenco trio for Verdon, Helen Gallagher, and Thelma Oliver. The Rich Man's Frog, a three-part ensemble dance for the Eurotrash patrons of the club Pompeii. Also, there were the beatniks of the jazzy Rhythm of Life, and the perhaps most memorably the showstopper Big Spender, with its lineup of deadpan taxi dancers sizing up fresh meat, each with her own come on as she slinked down to the footlights. Hey, mister, can I talk to you for a minute? Hey, monsieur, do you speak French? Oh, you're so tall. Actually, Big Spender is a unique dancing number whose great power comes from the utter lack of movement. The tense poses the girls freeze into as they lean over the railing of the Fandango Ballroom choral, eliciting applause every time a new one is struck. In his use of cinematic staging, Fosse streamlined the action. After she gets robbed and pushed into Central Park Lake, Charity begins to tell her story to the police. Then, with only a blast of this orchestra as the locker room slides in, Vernon is still mid-sentence. She finishes her tale to a taxi dancer co-workers, and since Verdon possessed the comic pathos of a Charlie Chaplin, it was entirely fitting that Fosse created a scene for her, trapped in a movie star Vittorio Vidal's closet while he made love to his latest conquest. That was the closest thing to the giddiness of silent movie comedy since Jerome Robbins' Keystone Cop Ballet in High Button Shoes. Verdon, watching through the keyhole, executed a series of comedy bits, drinking a beer and smoking a cigarette. Then she realizes her mistake, blowing the smoke into a zippered suit bag hanging in the closet. That not only cemented the character of the lovable, sad clown Charity Hope Valentine, but preserved Verdon's always fragile singing voice. Fosse took similar tack in Chicago, where he had Verdon's front and center in one of the biggest production numbers. We both reached for the gun, but since she was a ventriloquist dummy sitting on Jerry Orbach's lap, she never had to sing a note. With one foot solidly in old school craft, but with one eye toward the refreshingly new and innovative, Fosse made Sweet Charity into a kind of bridge show of the 1960s, linking the musical comedies of the George Abbott era and the state-of-the-art staging of Hal Prince, Michael Bennett, and Tommy Tune to come. Neil Simon. Neil Simon, the most successful American playwright ever, has had a long association with Broadway musicals. After contributions to the revues Catch a Star and New Faces of 56, he earned his stripes as a sketch writer on early television. After a smash with his first play, Come Below Your Horn, he started his book writing career with one of the funniest musicals ever, Little Me, which boasted more laughs per page than most other had per show. In between his remarkable string of his hit comedies, his hit musicals include Sweet Charity, Promises, Promises, and They're Playing Our Song. His only flop came with the musicalization of his movie, The Goodbye Girl, in 1993. The premier joke man of all time, Doc has also made uncredited contributions to many other shows, from Seesaw to A Chorus Line. Helen Gallagher, the ultimate survivor, began as a hoofer in the chorus, graduating to a tango specialty in high-button shoes and gaining a real attention with a splash review featuring In Touch and Go. After the failure of her next show, the Annette Fabre vehicle Make a Wish, she and co-star Harold Lang segued directly into the 1952 revival of Pal Joey, with Gallagher winning her first Tony Award for playing the delightful named Gladys Bumps. She had found a fan in Pal Joey's producer, Joel Stein, and he cast her as the star of his next show, Hazel Flag. A marathon role with singing and dancing enough for 3 shows, it foundered, and its failure tarnished Gallagher's stock as a star. She slipped back into replacement jobs in Pajama Game and Mame, and supporting roles in Sweet Charity and Cry for Us All, even standing by for Kate Ballard in the out-of-town closer Royal Flush. With the revival of No No Nanette in 1971, she became a hit all over again, with her Where Has My Hubby Gone blues, giving her the star spot she hadn't had in 20 years. She shrewdly parlayed her new acclaim into a steady gig on the long-running soap opera Ryan's Hope. Backstage, Bob Fosse spent hours in Times Square dance halls doing research, and Gwen Verdon went undercover and worked as a dance hall hostess. When she got tired, Gwen Verdon would cut the number "Where Am I Going?" from the show. When she received an angry letter from a theatergoer, Gwen calculated the time the number took in the show, the length of the show, and the price of a ticket, and she sent the audience member a prorated refund.